Deus Ex Invisible War is the highly anticipated sequel to a game that's more than 3 years old now, and one that combined role-playing, first-person shooting, and stealth action, as well as a deep storyline with sort of a cyberpunk, gothic, grim, futuristic, dystopian vision that made for a very unique and interesting combination of elements. It's a game that many consider to be a classic, and even though the original Deus Ex definitely had some problems, it stands the test of time as this very innovative and bold game. There really hasn't been much quite like it ever since, until the sequel, of course. The sequel actually is quite similar. It too combines action and stealth and role-playing elements. It's more accessible in some ways than the original game, but it is very much a direct sequel. It draws on your knowledge of the original game, and you may feel a bit left out if you haven't finished the original game prior to playing this one. But nevertheless, it too features its own kind of philosophical sci-fi story. If you've been busy watching the Matrix movies lately, it'll kind of seem to go hand in hand, what with the juxtaposition of people getting shot and people waxing philosophical about the nature of humankind and what have you. In Invisible War, you play as Alex D, who can either be male or female depending on the very first decision you make in the game, and is a student at the Tarsus Academy, which is basically this sort of covert ops school for gifted students. They become imbued with nanotechnology, and they in turn go on to become these kind of graduate commandos that are then hired by various corporations. What happens in the game's introductory cutscene is that Chicago, the city of Chicago, is pretty much destroyed in what seems to be an attack against the Tarsus Academy. Your character and some other trainees manage to escape and are relocated to the Tarsus Academy in Seattle, but that too is attacked in the first few minutes of the game. It seems that there's actually more than one organization that wants something from Tarsus and wants to get its hands on its student body, whether they're living or dead. So that's kind of the first interesting little dilemma that you need to figure out, and there are many other questions that quickly come up, and you'll soon learn to be mistrustful of basically every single person you meet in the game. Invisible War is also a shorter game than the original. It's just about 10 or 15 hours on the first playthrough, but you're never going to see it all the first time, because the key to this game, much like the original, is that you're constantly making decisions. You're siding with one side or another, and you'll often have these mutually exclusive goals where you can either do one thing or the other, help one party or its competitor, so you can't help both. Everything is pretty much gray in Invisible War. There's really no right or wrong in this game, and that's something that's both interesting and also slightly problematic in some ways. One issue with the original Deus Ex that also holds true of Invisible War is that the characters in this game just seem rather two-dimensional and flat. You really don't have much of a sense of their motivations. They all kind of want something from you, and you can pretty much wantonly go around killing people without much in the way of repercussions, so it's hard to really feel too attached to any of the organizations you're working for, especially since they're all pretty creepy and you won't have much knowledge of what their true motivations are until much later. So you'll end up having to make choices just based on your gut feeling, or maybe even arbitrarily in some cases. The manual for Invisible War sort of flaunts that deadly force really isn't a requirement at any point in Deus Ex. That means theoretically you could go through this entire game without killing anyone, maybe without even engaging in too many confrontations at all. It's true, stealth is an option. You can kind of lurk in shadows, you can equip your character with certain special abilities that make him or her invisible and skulk around that way. However, in practice, there really is a pretty clear-cut path of least resistance through Deus Ex Invisible War, and that involves killing lots and lots of people. Pretty early on, you can get yourself a sniper rifle, and using that, you can shoot people in the head and they die instantly. The AI in this game is quite simply terrible, if not outright missing in some cases, so enemies really won't put up much of a fight. You won't have the odds stacked against you too high either. You'll only be facing, maybe several enemies at a time. So it's really just quite easy to take out anyone who's standing in your way, and why would you bother to sneak past them when there's such an easier option to take? I mean, you can make the game artificially more difficult on yourself if you really want, but there's no real reward for doing so. Again, the morality of the game is very, very gray, so you won't be judged or penalized in any way for killing people. In fact, you'll even be rewarded for it, because you'll get their weapons and, you know, be able to fling their bodies around and do other kinds of things like that. One of the most obvious new additions in Deus Ex Invisible War from the original, or really over pretty much any other current game, is that it incorporates realistic dynamic lighting and physics. This manifests itself in some pretty moody and atmospheric-looking environments, but it's also got some problems in the implementation. Specifically, you can pick up and toss around and bump into just about any object in the environment, and anything that isn't bolted down you can pick up and lug around and toss and stuff. The problem is, in practice, it seems like all these things are either inflatable or made out of styrofoam, because they all just tend to kind of bounce around and flop around in a manner that isn't entirely realistic. Surprisingly enough, just as the characters in the game don't act realistic when they're still alive, they don't act realistic when they're dead either. You could pick them up and lug them around as though they were completely weightless and just toss them like they're crash test dummies or mannequins or something like that, and meanwhile other characters in the environment may react little or not at all to all the bizarre things you're doing. You could poke your sniper rifle right in people's faces, you could steal things from off their desks right in front of them, and they won't really pay it much mind or any mind at all. And again, the careful illusion that's created by some of the atmospheric lighting effects and some of the backstory sort of begins to collapse if you start messing around with the game too much, and yet the presence of these realistic physics seems to invite this sort of behavior. Invisible War is available both for the PC and Xbox, and the two versions are more or less identical. The controls map nicely to either system, either via the standard mouse and keyboard controls on the PC or standard first-person shooter controls on the Xbox. And the game performs pretty well on the Xbox, and well if you have a high-end PC. The PC version is capable of looking better than the Xbox version, provided you have the latest hardware and such, whereas on the Xbox you're guaranteed pretty good performance. Though don't expect the game to run as smoothly as other first-person perspective games you might have played lately, because it does do all the fancy physics and lighting stuff, which seems to bog the frame rate down. On the other hand, it does lend to some pretty detailed-looking environments, and the characters tend to look pretty good too. You need to work with Invisible War to really enjoy it. Much like the previous game, you need to kind of open your mind up to some pretty wacky ideas as the plot begins to unfold, and you'll also need to look the other way past some pretty unsightly issues like the AI and some of the physics and things like that. Some of the loading times are a little lengthy too. So this game definitely has its weaknesses, but as well it has its significant strengths, and there's nothing quite like it out there apart from the original game. So if you're open to a rather unique and interesting gaming experience, then by all means give Deus Ex Invisible War a try.